Hi everybody, Matthew Turnage here. Hope everybody's had a good Thanksgiving holiday weekend, or at least those of you in the U.S. And I hope it's been a good weekend for everybody else around the world as we've gotten to see the premiere of the Beatles Get Back. Now, originally I thought I might try to do a review of each part as it came out, but with holiday commitments with family, I just really honestly didn't have the time. Thursday, I had just enough time to watch part one in the morning before I was off with family the rest of the day, and all the way up until late in the evening, and then Friday, actually, because of family commitments I'd had, I really only had time to watch about half of part two in the morning, and then in the evening and watch the other half. And probably could have made a video at that point, but it seemed like since it was already Friday night by that point, might as well watch part three, which I did this morning, and had a busy day today. Again, big college football day today. So I thought I'd just put my thoughts together on all three parts. I haven't gone around reading other reviews or watching other videos yet. I kind of wanted to give my thoughts fresh, but I'm really looking forward to seeing what everybody else thought of this. Just as a general overview of the whole series, I have to say, of course, I loved it. I thought it was great. It's a lot to take in with 8 hours, a lot to take in. So what I've got here are just some notes that I wrote down, and I didn't even take notes. I didn't want to take notes while I was watching the episodes because I wanted to be able to focus on watching it and enjoying it. And then what I did was, as soon as I finished each part, I just jotted down a few things that stuck out in my mind immediately after watching it that I want to talk about. But it's a lot to take in. I'm sure there's a lot more that didn't spring to mind when I was writing these notes, and it's the sort of thing that I think I'll be able to watch multiple times and get a lot out of it, because there's just so much to absorb with that much footage, and it's great stuff. Probably, I think what I'm going to do going back and rewatching it is space it out a bit more. So what I may do is just watch like a day or two at a time, like, maybe day one and day two, and then wait another, come back and watch day three and day four later, or something like that. And that might give me a little more chance to really dive into the details a little bit more. But here are my thoughts. I'm just going to go through some things I jotted down from each part. So part one, one of the things that really stood out to me about part one as I was watching it was that great Beatles humor. There was a lot of little funny bits all throughout. That a couple that I made note of were, one was near the beginning when they were talking about where to have the live show and potentially going overseas. And that's something else I made a note of, is that Michael Lindsay Hogg was really for this idea of going to Africa. He kept trying to bring it back around. He really wanted to go to Africa, but very early on, I think maybe on the first day, Paul says that they're not going abroad. He said, Ringo does not want to go abroad, so that means we're not going abroad. And then he made the joke. He said, the three of us will go abroad with Jimmy Nichols, which I thought that was funny. Another funny bit was that sequence where they're playing "I'm So Tired." Paul is singing it, and that's one of the fun things too, is getting to hear Paul sing some John songs and vice versa throughout this whole thing. But Paul singing "I'm So Tired," and there's all these cuts of them. They're tired. They're rubbing their eyes and yawning and all this stuff, and I thought that was really funny. And then another funny, even in the face of, bad times, the humor comes through at the near the end of part one, when George has quit, and then Paul says to Maureen Starkey, Ringo's wife, something like, if you can learn A7, G7, and D7 over the weekend, then you're in, that she could be George's replacement. So I thought that was funny that, the humor throughout, we know the Beatles were funny guys, so plenty of good examples of that. Another interesting thing about part one is they're starting to, develop these songs and the arrangements and things, is seeing some of the other people outside of the band, their contributions. For example, Mal Evans, as Paul is working on The Long and Winding Road, and Mal Evans is there bouncing ideas back and forth about some lyrics. Um, on Let It Be, Glenn Johns really gets very involved in the arrangement and making a lot of suggestions there, which I thought was really interesting to see. Um, it was great seeing Linda when she came in, and they all look so young, but Linda was one that especially I was struck by when she first showed up, was just how young she looked. But I thought it was really neat as she's taking her photographs, and they did the same thing I think in part two with some of Ethan Russell's when he was taking photographs in Apple Studios. But it would show her taking the photograph, and then it'd switch, and you'd see the still image of the photograph that she took at that moment that the camera was filming her taking the photographs. And so I just thought that was a neat effect to kind of really put those pictures in the context of those moments that we're watching, because many of these pictures are ones that are very well known to us. In fact, I think one in the part two, one of the Ethan Russell pictures that they showed was that they froze on was that photo of John from the cover of the Let It Be album. Then another thing about part one that I really enjoyed is seeing some of these songs that began from not very much and began to get fleshed out, like Don't Let Me Down. At the beginning, it's just this chorus is really just about all John has. But you see the band working on it, and it's starting to take shape. It's starting to develop a bit more. And of course, the biggest example of that throughout the whole thing is the song Get Back, because that's the one song we see, ex nihilo almost, come out of thin air, is they're sitting around and Paul is just kind of jamming and strumming on his bass and just trying to see what comes out, and then he hits on this this rhythm, and he starts singing Get Back, and it's just the very beginning of it all the way through we see with that song, because so many of the others, they've had an idea that they were working on at home, and they bring in, like, especially George's songs, he'll say things like, I think he says with For You Blue, and I Mean Mine, both of them, I think he says, this is one that I wrote last night at home. So it's something he's showing the group, and it may not be a fully fleshed out song, but the very genesis of it happens off screen. But Get Back, we see it happen on screen, and that's really fascinating to watch. Another great bit is they're jamming, and they're jamming on rock and roll music. And, it says on there that this was the opening song on their 1966 tour, their last tour. And it's as they're jamming on it there at Twickenham, and then it's intercutting with footage from Japan in 1966. And, it's really only, about 2.5 years, about 2.5 years in between, that concert and Twickenham, and they've changed so much in that time. I thought that was a really fascinating contrast, putting in that Japan footage from '66 next to Twickenham. I thought that was a great idea by Peter Jackson. And of course, it was a great way to end part one. They ended on George leaving, and then going into the closing credits. Isn't it a pity? It was a great choice. I really love that. And, let me say about, seeing George leave, that was really fascinating to watch that whole thing too. Because it's, there's not like a big blow up. Obviously he, as they're sitting there and working through the song, and then he's wanting to play something, and Paul doesn't think it's the right fit. And you can tell because they had that argument earlier, the one that's very famous for being in the Let It Be film, where George is saying, I'll play what you want me to play, or whatever will please you. So they've had that, and then Paul is telling him, but if you're playing this, then it's kind of stepping on what John is doing, and Paul really is trying to be diplomatic. But George, I think at that point, George, because he had talked about how, all the songs, if it's a Paul song, that he should feel like he wrote it, and vice versa. It should be that collaborative. But of course, Paul, for better or for worse, has very specific ideas about his songs, and so and I think Paul is generally, it's not necessarily an ego thing. I think Paul really wants to do what he thinks is best for the song, but but of course, and George, and I don't blame George either for feeling stifled that that he can't be creative in the way he wants to be. So as Paul tells him that, George just kind of completely shuts himself down. It's really interesting how, because he is totally withdrawn. In John, I can't, maybe day 4. There's a day earlier in there in part 1 where John is very withdrawn. We're not, at least in the footage that we see, he's not interacting very much. He's not giving a whole lot. But on the day that, I guess day 7, when George leaves, I thought John was very engaged, because there are scenes where he and Paul are both standing, and they're working on Get Back, and they're going back and forth with ideas and things, and Ringo seems to be into it. We don't see him on camera as much from the angles we have, because he's back behind the drums, but he's involved, and George is just kind of sitting there. He's completely disengaged himself from the process. And so in that sense, you can kind of see, but it's the thing that you always hear about the Beatles and their interactions is a lot of passive aggressiveness, because really, and I'm sure George probably felt like, he's had the discussion before, but what he could have done was try to say, hey, look, I need to have more of myself in this thing, and tried to stick up for himself or something. But he's, to me, it's a little childish the way he does handle it. Not blaming it all for feeling the way he did, but to just kind of say, all right, I'm done, and I'm leaving the group, and just walk off like that. And you can tell it really hacked John off when that happened. But it was a great way to end part 1, kind of with that cloud hanging over them, and then going into part 2. I think we kind of thought, certainly I did, well, if it's 3 parts, it kind of makes sense. Part 1 is Twickenham, and part 2 is Apple Studios, and part 3 is the rooftop. Of course, it doesn't exactly work out that way. And I think Peter Jackson made the right choice on the episode breaks, because we come back at part 2 for the first part of part 2. They're still in Twickenham, because we need to end part 1 with George leaving the band. That's the most dramatic point. But then in part 2, a lot of interesting stuff in there. Of course, the thing we've heard the audio before, but Paul saying that whole bit about after the meeting with George on the Sunday, on the Monday morning, in 50 years' time, it'll be, how hilarious it would be if, they said the Beatles broke up because Yoko sat on an amp. But yeah, it really makes you curious what exactly was said in that discussion at Ringo's house on the Sunday, because when Paul comes in and they're talking about it, he's talking about John and Yoko, and that dynamic, and how it's changed Yoko bringing in, and we can't tell John not to bring her in, because he said he will choose her over us, and let the lovers be in love, as he says, and that sort of thing. He's trying to be very diplomatic to John, but he's recognizing that it's causing a strain on the interaction, having her there involved all the time. But that makes it sound like part of the point of contention is the creative dynamic changing by John having Yoko in, and we've heard that George was bothered by the fact that at times in that period, John wouldn't say anything, and that Yoko would completely speak for him, and George wanted John to be the one speaking for himself, that was a source of friction. But at lunchtime, when John is there and John and Paul are having their discussion about the issues with George, the Yoko aspect of it is not discussed at all. That discussion is all about them, and mainly Paul not giving George the creative freedom he has. So, which has seemed to be, what we saw more of in part one. So it's kind of interesting. I kind of wish we knew. I'm sure both of those were factors in George's decision to leave. It'd be interesting to know how much it was one over the other. Um, my impression is probably more George's conflict with Paul. Um, Although it's interesting as you watch it through, yeah, maybe Paul wants to have his own way on his own songs, but he seems very engaged in a lot of George's songs when George brings them in, and getting involved, with them. Particular, is it in part three when he first comes in with Old Brown Shoe? And and he's playing it on the piano, and Paul is very into it. And then Paul goes and gets on the drums to kind of get a beat going, and then and that's a cool sequence because Billy Preston is jamming on the bass too and all that stuff. I'm kind of jumping ahead now. Also from part two, Get Back is taking further shape, and that's again another great thing to see is the whole progression of this song. We see it in part one, and it's just kind of a jam, and that's another great thing in part one. I forgot to mention is they're doing it, and then Paul is playing it, and then Ringo's involved. Ringo's singing along, Get Back, as they're bringing it together, and Ringo tries to help with lyric ideas too. But seeing it further take shape in part two is great. All the stuff that we get to see, bits of songs that didn't really do a whole lot with, but Peter Jackson includes that stuff like Backseat of My Car and Another Day. Just those little snippets, he's sure to include those. And the work ethic of Paul, is that last day in Twickenham, they're packing everything up and getting it out, but Glenn Johns has set up that little 8-track recording thing, and so Paul takes advantage of the opportunity and slips in there and does a demo of "Oh Darling." He can't let the day go completely to waste. One thing I noticed is they come back in Apple the very first day. George, at least in the footage that's shown, George is still very quiet, and he's not really. He seems happy to be there. He's smiling at times, but he's not really interjecting himself the way he was on the first few days in Twickenham. But when Billy Preston comes in, there's a big change. George is very much more involved and very much more into it. And Billy is obviously having a great time, loving to be there. And, we've always heard it said that, the mood really lifts when Billy came in. And you could really see it in this film. Peter really showed that very well, I thought. I love the discussion about India when Paul is talking about the films made in India and how they, as he's talking about all this stuff, Peter Jackson was able to get that footage, and we see all these shots of the trip to India the year before. I thought that was great, and it seemed to me that George gets a little bit defensive there, because obviously Paul did not buy into the whole thing. Really, none of them, I don't think, really did to the extent of George. The whole, Maharishi philosophy or whatever. Although I understand that, as far as I know, I think Ringo and Paul both continued perform transcendental meditation to this day. But Paul is obviously not treating it with a lot of reverence necessarily, because he goes through this bit where he's talking, like he's saying, he sees this footage, Johnny saying, you're not acting like yourself, you weren't yourself or something like that. And George seems to get defensive about, he's like, well, the whole thing was to go find ourselves or, something, but I just thought that was interesting. I had a note here, Paul having a hard time adjusting. Now I can't remember exactly what I was thinking at the time. Oh, yes, now I remember. Yeah, so, they're having that discussion where, they're talking about the project and how it's kind of different. It was supposed to be a TV thing, and now it's a film and all that. And Paul, I understand, because I can be this way too. If you're in a group project and you start out with um, a certain idea or certain goal of where you're going, and then it changes, sometimes it's kind of, for me, it can be this way too. If you're locked in on a certain idea, it can be kind of hard to completely let that go and switch gears to the way the group is taking it. And so I thought that was interesting to watch that. Um, let's see here. Yeah, part three, seeing the actual takes of the songs is great. I would love how they'd be doing it. I'd be thinking, wait a minute, that sounds like the version on the album. And then Peter would put up, this is the take that appears on the Let It Be album. That was one of the fun things about part three is all the takes happen, and then he points out which ones are the takes. Um, yeah, and of course we knew about this too, but Paul's reluctance to go on the roof. Paul was the one pushing for the live show, but he wasn't completely enthused by the idea of doing it on the roof. And I thought it was a great moment as they're talking about it. Paul seems kind of iffy on it, and then George just flat out says, "I don't want to go on the roof." And then I love that it's Ringo is the first one to jump and says, "I want to go on the roof." And then John is like, "Well, I want to go on the roof too." So I thought that was great to kind of see the two of them, especially Ringo being the first one to kind of jump in and push forward for the roof, and then get that immediate backing from John. And I think, of course, once John is on board with it, I think that was all it took. With John on board, I think the group was going to follow no matter what. But it was great seeing Ringo being the first one to kind of voice that. I love how the rooftop was presented with the multi-angles. They'd split the screen up and you'd see multiple angles at the same time. Following the story of the policeman coming in and trying to get up there, that was great. But seeing the whole concert that way was just amazing. I loved the whole thing. It was obviously the highlight of the whole 8 hours was the rooftop for me. And I thought it was really well done and well presented. And the band was having fun up there. Yeah, they lots of smiles. George is smiling too. I loved how my wife made a comment about how George was the one saying he didn't want to go on the roof, but near the end when Mal switches off his amp, George walks back over there and is like, "I'm not done yet," and he switches it back on. So if I'm up here, I'm going to keep playing. I thought that was great. And then. And of course, with that being such a high point, it's also great. Right after that, then they show the band listening to the playback downstairs. So it's good seeing them, still kind of on that adrenaline high of the performance, and seeing how they thought of it immediately afterwards was great. But that's such a high point and a climax. How do you follow that up when we know there's one more day? I wondered how he was going to do that, show the rooftop and then show day 22 and in the movie. So I thought it was actually smart the way he presented it, with those day 22 footage being shown as the ending credits roll. So it's like an epilogue almost. And I thought that was really well done. And of course, ending it with the album take of Let It Be. It's a great way to close out the film. So I thought it was brilliant. I loved it. I'm going to be watching again, maybe not in the next couple days, but like I said, probably within a week or so. I'm going to start diving back into it a couple days at a time and really kind of pouring through it. There's just so much to see in there, and the footage is all great. It's presented extremely well. I think they're pretty clever with things that only had dialogue, of using certain shots to kind of keep it still visually interesting. Even the lunchtime conversation with Paul with the hidden flower pot, the way they do that scene with the flower pot in the cafeteria, just showing like the room and kind of giving you the sense of that, and showing the dialogue and moving it around in different colors for John and Paul. I thought that was very cleverly done. They kept the whole thing really interesting and moving. Seeing the creative process that they go through is fascinating, and I'm so glad that they had all this footage, and so glad that they decided to represent it this way. I just hope that as Peter Jackson said in his interview on Things We Said Today, the ultimate goal would be to get a Blu-ray release with this film and the original Let It Be film together in one package. So it's like Get Back is like the making of the Let It Be documentary, and having that whole thing would be brilliant. But I'm glad they did it. Glad they gave us so much footage. I absolutely loved it. I hope you did too, but let me know your thoughts in the comments. I really love to see what everybody else has to say about it. And thanks for watching.